December 1st, 1948. Just before sunrise, on a quiet stretch of Somerton Beach in Adelaide, South Australia, a man was found dead. He was lying against the seawall, dressed in a brown suit, with his head resting against the wall and his legs extended toward the beach. At first, there was nothing about him that seemed extraordinary. He looked like an ordinary man who had simply fallen asleep, but he wasn't asleep. He was dead. And within hours, police realized they had a problem. They didn't know who he was. There was no wallet, no identification papers, no passport, nothing that could immediately tell investigators his name, where he lived, or who might be waiting for him. His clothing offered almost no help. The labels had been removed from several items. Police searched his pockets carefully. They found some ordinary possessions: cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, a comb, and other small personal items, but nothing that gave them a name. His fingerprints were taken, his photograph was circulated, the police contacted authorities and searched through missing person records. Newspapers published photographs of the dead man, hoping that someone would recognize his face, but nobody came forward. The mystery deepened. Who was this man, and why was there nothing on him that could identify him? The post-mortem examination created even more uncertainty. There was no obvious external injury that explained his death. The pathologist suspected poisoning, but the available examinations could not establish a definite cause, and without knowing who the man was, investigators had almost nothing to work with. The body was eventually displayed publicly in the hope that someone might recognize him. People came forward. Some believed they knew him, but none of those identifications could be confirmed. The man remained unidentified. Then, several weeks later, investigators found something that would turn the case into one of Australia's most famous mysteries: a tiny piece of paper. It had been discovered in a small pocket inside the man's clothing. On it were two words: Tamám Shud. The phrase means roughly ended or finished. It wasn't a random note. Police eventually traced those words to a book called the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám. Investigators discovered that the words had been cut from a copy of the book. But where was the book? That question led them to another discovery. A copy of the Rubáiyát had been found in a car near Adelaide around the same period. The book appeared to be connected to the piece of paper found on the dead man, and inside it, investigators discovered something even stranger: a series of letters, a sequence that looked like it might be a code. There was also a telephone number. Police traced the number to a local woman. Her identity became one of the most intriguing parts of the investigation. She was a nurse named Jessica Thompson, although she was publicly referred to for years as Jestin. Investigators showed her the plaster cast of the dead man's face. According to the police records, her reaction suggested that she recognized him, but she did not identify him publicly, and that left investigators with another question. If she knew who the man was, why wouldn't she say his name? For decades, the case remained frozen between facts and unanswered questions. The dead man had no confirmed identity. The meaning of the mysterious letters was never established. The significance of the telephone number remained uncertain, and the exact circumstances surrounding his death were never conclusively explained. Over time, the case became surrounded by theories. Some suggested espionage, others imagined secret relationships, coded messages, and Cold War connections. But theories are not evidence, and after all the speculation, one fact remained unchanged. A man had died on Somerton Beach. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew exactly why he died, and nobody could explain the strange trail of clues surrounding him. Then, more than 7 decades later, something happened that investigators in 1948 could never have imagined: DNA. For more than 70 years, the Somerton Man had no confirmed name. He was one of Australia's most famous, unidentified bodies. Then, in 2022, forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick and researcher Derek Abbott announced that they had identified the man as Charles Webb, a Melbourne-born electrical engineer. Their conclusion was based on genealogical research and DNA evidence obtained from hair preserved with the original plaster bust made from the man's head. Researchers built a family tree using genetic matches and historical records. Eventually, the evidence pointed toward Charles Webb, a man born in Melbourne in 1905. alive, an electrical engineer, a real person with a documented life. For the first time, the Somerton Man appeared to have a name, Charles Webb. But identifying him did not solve the entire mystery. It created a new one. What happened to Charles Webb before he arrived in Adelaide, and why did he end up dead on Somerton Beach? Researchers found that Webb had been married to a woman named Dorothy Robertson. Their marriage had broken down. Records indicated that the relationship had been troubled, and Webb had disappeared from his family's lives. But many details of his final months remained uncertain. The discovery of his possible identity also gave researchers an opportunity to revisit one of the strangest clues in the case, the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám. For decades, people had imagined that the book's torn-out words and mysterious letters represented some kind of secret message, perhaps a code, perhaps a confession, perhaps even evidence of espionage. But there is an important distinction between what the evidence shows and what people have imagined it might mean. The famous sequence of letters was never conclusively decoded. The telephone number was real, the book was real, the piece of paper was real, the dead man was real, but the connection between those clues and a larger secret was never proven. And that is where the mystery becomes especially interesting, because the Somerton Man case isn't simply about one unexplained death. It's about how a handful of genuine clues can create an enormous story when the most important piece of information is missing, the identity of the person at the center of it all. For decades, people wondered whether the man was a spy, but there has never been conclusive evidence proving that. They wondered whether Tamám Shud was a suicide message, but that has never been established either. They wondered whether Jessica Thompson knew the man's identity. She never publicly confirmed that she did, and they wondered whether the mysterious letters were a code. No definitive solution has ever been accepted. Then there is the question of death itself. The original investigation could not establish exactly what killed him. There were no obvious signs of violence. The post-mortem findings created suspicion of poisoning, but the evidence available at the time was insufficient to determine a specific poison or provide a definitive cause of death. That means one of the central questions remains unanswered. How did Charles Webb die? And perhaps even more importantly, why was he in Somerton? The 2022 identification changed the story forever. The Somerton Man was no longer simply an unknown stranger found on an Australian beach. He was potentially Charles Webb, a man who had been born, worked, married, and lived a life before becoming one of the world's most famous unidentified dead men. But identification is not the same as explanation. A name can tell us who someone was. It doesn't necessarily tell us what happened to them, and that's why the Somerton Man mystery continues to fascinate people more than 70 years later. Because the case began with a simple question: who was the man on the beach? In 2022, researchers came closer than ever to answering it, but the deeper questions remain. Why was Charles Webb in Adelaide? What exactly happened in the final days of his life? What did Tamám Shud really mean in the context of his story? Who wrote or intended the mysterious letters found in the book? And what, if anything, was the significance of the telephone number? We may never know for certain. What we do know is this: on December 1st, 1948, a man was found dead on Somerton Beach. For decades, the world knew him only as the Somerton Man. More than 70 years later, forensic genealogy gave that mystery a possible name: Charles Webb. But a name is only the beginning of an investigation, because sometimes the hardest mystery isn't discovering who someone was, it's discovering what happened to them.